Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you back at the library tonight. So welcome back if you haven't been to any programs yet, since we've reopened to having our programs in person. Also welcome to everybody watching virtually at home. We're glad to have you with us. And if you do have any questions, put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Before we get started, we have some books over here that might be of interest to you. You can take them home, just stop by the circulation desk, check them out on your way out. And I have to let you know, we have a couple of great things coming up in just the next week. On Sunday, we have our Arts Alive concert. We have Matt and Cynthia Gruel, who have been here before, and they are dynamic duo of entertainments, husband and wife team. They sing, play the piano. And this show will be, it's called I Feel Good, the hits of the 60s. So some nostalgia and, you know, there was just kind of fun music in the 60s and some inspiring music. And I'm sure they're going to give us a little bit of everything. And then next, this is the Sunday, I think I said at 2 o'clock. Then next Wednesday on the 28th at 6:30, we're having Medicare 101. If you're just looking to get into Medicare or it's on your horizon, there's a lot to learn, and it really would be good to attend a program where you can get all the information you need and ask the questions. This gentleman is coming, is very highly recommended by other libraries. And even if you already have Medicare, things change from year to year, and there's a lot to keep up with, and you might have questions specific to your needs. So please try to join us on Wednesday. You register for those online, and they both will be hybrid, meaning you can attend here or you can attend remotely. I think that's about it for the next week right now, anyway. So tonight we are having a candy talk. Who doesn't love candy? Chicago's sweet candy history. And we have Leslie Goddard, who we love. She has given us so many great programs. First person portrayals like Amelia Earhart. And I think everyone's favorite is remembering Marshall Fields at Christmas because, yeah, see, everybody loves that. So tonight, I think we're going to be in for another rare treat. There's so much to the Chicago candy history. I didn't know that a third of the candy was produced right here. The candy in the United States was produced right here. Snickers and Tootsie Rolls and Wrigley scum and all kinds. And so we're going to have a lot of trivia, maybe even a few quiz questions. Okay, so put on your candy thinking caps and welcome Leslie Goddard.
And I have to tell you, this is the cover of my book. The book itself is turning 10 years old this year, and I cannot believe the changes in the candy industry over the past 10 years. So I've recently been doing some revising on this program. But I have to start, first of all, I'll tell you, I am a historian. I have no direct connection with any of these great candy companies. I got interested in this topic because I was working in museums and I found out, I was in Evanston and I found out that Otto Schneering, inventor of Baby Ruth, had lived there. And so had Mr. Holloway of Milk Duds fame. And I thought, this is amazing. And someone said to me, you can find that in many Chicago area communities because this was such a huge candy making center. So let's start. Assuming you've seen nothing here and you've heard nothing coming in. What were some of the candies that you knew before you came here tonight had been made or invented in Chicago? Toss them out. Frango mints, the Great Marshall Field. Mars candy, Snickers, Three Musketeers, you might have heard of them. What's that? Yeah, M&Ms, yeah. Red Hots, Ferrara pan candy. They also made lemon heads and atomic fireballs. Curtis candy, if you've ever heard of Baby Ruth or Butterfinger, they're from Chicago. Leaf brands. Did you ever eat malted milk balls under the brand name Whoppers? Probably Leaf's most famous, but they also made spearmint leaves and orange slices, a lot of different candies. There's more, keep going. Brock's, ever hear of Brock's candies? Absolutely. World's finest chocolate, yes. Do you remember the fundraising chocolate bars? Fannie Mae. Someone told me if you want to get a fight going in Chicago, ask which is better, Frango mints or Fannie Mae mint meltaways. I said I have to try both to tell. All right, let me show you my collage. These are just some of the great Chicago candy brands, and we got a lot of them. But did you know, towards the center, a little bit to the right, Demet's Turtles began at the Demet's Ice Cream and Candy Store in Chicago. We mentioned Ferrara, we mentioned Mars, we mentioned Curtis. We didn't mention Jelly Belly. Jelly Belly has had a factory in North Chicago for quite a long time. They are not headquartered in Chicago, but they do have a factory here. If you like hard candy, towards the lower left, you might remember Reed's candies. They made butterscotch discs and root beer discs. Root beer, remember those? Sort of like Lifesavers, but better. Right? Or you might remember Peerless candy. Peerless made a lot of those. I don't know about your family, but we used to have little bowls at Christmas time of those hard candies. A lot of like Starlight Mints. And do you remember the hard raspberry candies with a yellow belly? They really pioneered that kind of a thing. O. Henry, one of the first great candy bars in the United States, is from Chicago. Cracker Jack, although some people say that's much too healthy to be a candy, but it is from Chicago. We mentioned Tootsie Rolls. Wrigley's, if you consider gum a candy, which I absolutely do. This is only some of the candy brands, but I think it shows you a couple of things. Number one, Chicago is home to some of the biggest players in the candy business. Brock's, Mars, I was about to say Nestle. Well, actually, I should say Nestle because the Curtis Candy Company was sold to Nestle, which made Baby Ruth and Butterfinger for a while, recently was sold. Some big players and some much smaller companies that often had a real niche, the way World's Finest Chocolate does with fundraising candy bars. And you might even think of Ferrara in the upper right in terms of pan candies. For most of its history, Chicago did make a third of the nation's candy. If you went to a candy counter in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there is a 1 in 3 chance that whatever you bought would have been made or invented in Chicago. As late as 1963, Chicago's total candy output was double that of the second biggest candy making city, which was New York at the time. At its peak, the Chicago industry employed about 25,000 Chicagoans. And that's not even counting people who worked for suppliers and things like that. So since I'm not an heir to any of these companies, I'm a historian. And when I started this research, the question I had first was, why Chicago? Of all the cities in all the United States, why would Chicago be a big candy center? What would you guess if you had to guess? Was that, you got it. Transportation. Transportation is number one. This is the pioneer. And it's linked to location. If you look at Chicago, as early as the 1850s, a third of the nation's rail lines are coming through the city. That's partly useful because you can ship out finished candy to stores quickly, but even more important, that is what made Chicago the center through which all the agriculture of the US starts flowing. And this means you can get products for rock bottom prices in Chicago, and your cost of shipping the products out is very low because you don't have to pay to get it to the railroads. And when you think about things like candy, you're talking about a lot of ingredients that have a short shelf life. You're talking about milk in the 19th century. Milk spoilage was a real thing. In the years before sophisticated refrigerated boxcars, before interstate transportation, spoilage was much more of a consideration. Chicago could get agricultural products quickly and cheaply. That's the number one reason. And to put this in perspective, if you look at Brock's in the 1970s, during rush seasons, and by the way, we're just starting the rush candy season. It tends to run from fall, sort of Halloween through spring holidays like Easter. During the rush season, Brock's factory in the 70s was shipping out up to 2 million pounds of candy a day. The amount of raw ingredients you need for that kind of output is enormous. And a lot of the great Chicago candy factories, if you look closely, you'll see the railroad spur lines going right into that. But I don't think it's the only reason why Chicago became a big candy center. So for one of the other reasons, let me give you the names of some of the great Chicago candy makers. See if you can tell me what they have in common. You ready? E.J. Brock, Salvatore Ferrara, Gustav Golitz, the Ruckheim brothers. Okay, I'm exaggerating. What do they have in common?
Chocolate.
Oh, chocolate. Yes, they do. Well, yeah. I was thinking much more
Europeans.
that they're immigrants. Yeah. Immigration was a huge force in the Chicago candy industry in particular. And we sometimes forget this. I was a little startled when I first really thought about this particular piece of a Brock's ad from the 60s. Underneath the logo, it says, please ask for BROX. That's in case you don't speak German and you don't know how to pronounce this German name, Brock's. And if you don't get it, do you see the little ditty? Buy the bag or buy the box. Your best candy buy is. Partly it's a cute slogan, but partly it's a pronunciation help for people who don't speak German necessarily. Chicago's peak of immigration really coincided with a lot of big changes in the candy industry. If you look at Chicago in 1860, so right on the verge of the Civil War, the city was already half foreign born. By the time you get to 1890, somewhere between 75 and 79% of Chicagoans are either foreign born or first generation, usually in Europe. What's important for that for candy is that candy was really attractive to recently arrived immigrants. It's pretty cheap to start. All you need is a good recipe and a kitchen. And candy has this way to bring back really powerful emotional recollections. If you remember, if you had a favorite candy when you went to the movies as a kid, if you can imagine moving to a new country, those tastes from the old world very quickly become really special. So an immigrant who is producing old world style candies has a ready market in other immigrants from that background. And we see different immigrants bringing different expertise. So for example, Germans had a real skill working with sugar-based candies like caramels. Germans created the first lollipops. They would stick slate pencils into melted sugar solutions in molds. Italians brought expertise in panning. And if you've never heard of panning, let me show you. This is the interior of the Ferrara Pan Candy Company in Forest Park in the 1980s. Those big round kettles, they look like clothes dryers a little bit. Those are the panning machines. You put a nut or a little piece of candy in, and you revolve the pan while a worker pours in coloring and flavorings, and that little center will build up a smooth, even candy shell. If you start with, let's say, a nut, you can get a candy-coated nut like, you ever been to an Italian-American wedding and they always have those pastel candy-coated almonds, Jordan almonds, right? Those are made by the panning process. And this is actually where Ferrara Pan Candy got its start. Salvatore Ferrara came to the US from Italy in 1900, founded the Ferrara Pan Candy Company in 1908. He was already a confectioner. He knew panning already, started making candied almonds for other Italian immigrants. Then in 1919, he joined up with his brothers-in-law, the Baffardis, to expand, to start panning not just almonds, but other candies and other nut centers. They eventually built this factory in Forest Park. If you've ever driven into Chicago in the Eisenhower, you might have passed the Ferrara factory. By the way, they have a little outlet store there. If you've never been, you can get really cheap candies. Some of their big hits include, by the way, you might be able to see, just underneath the sign where it says Ferrara Pan Candy Company, painted on the building in this photograph is a box top from Lemonheads. Lemonheads date to 1962. The story always was that Salvatore Ferrara's son, Nello, had a kid, and Sal looked at him and said, "That kid's head looks like a lemon," thus leading to the invention of Lemonheads. They now have a whole line of fruity candies. They call them their head lines. But some of their other big hits, Red Hots, those little cinnamon imperials, those date to 1932. And Atomic Fireballs debuted in 1954, right during the atomic age. Jawbreakers in the lower left are today known as Jaw Busters. I love that name. Why would anyone want to break their jaw? But if you're a kid, you absolutely do. And Boston Baked Beans, which I love because the name has nothing to do with what they taste like. They're candy-coated peanuts, but they look like Boston Baked Beans. For most of Chicago's history, there were more Boston Baked Beans coming out of Chicago than out of Boston, thanks to the Ferrara Pan Candy Company. Ferrara recently was acquired by Ferraro, which is an Italian company. They also own Fannie Mae, and they bought a lot of the old Wonka brands. Third reason for Chicago's candy dominance, and this one is a hard one to explain. So let me talk about the Blummer Chocolate Company. I've been told by the family it is pronounced Blummer, not Blummer. If you've ever gotten off the train in Chicago and it smells like chocolate chip cookies, this is probably what you're smelling. They were founded on Kinsey, right where the Chicago River splits into, back in 1939. Henry Blummer Sr. and his brothers Bernard and Aloysius. They were from Wisconsin, which is a pretty good place if you're running a business that requires a lot of things like milk and butter. But they didn't found their company in Chicago. When they started this chocolate company, they located it in Chicago because they said, this is where our customers, the candy makers, were located. In other words, once Chicago became home to some candy companies, suppliers started opening up. From a very early date, Chicago was really popular with people who made chocolate, people who made flavor extracts and paper boxes and all the supplies that you might need for candy making. By the way, the Blummer Chocolate Company, if you've never heard of them, they're the largest wholesale chocolate manufacturer in the country. Hershey is the largest retail chocolate manufacturer. Chocolate is actually really difficult to manufacture. It's got a lot of cocoa butter, which is fat, and with milk chocolate, you've got a lot of milk, which is mostly water. It's hard to do. So a lot of companies purchase chocolate, and Blummer works with a lot of companies to supply specially made chocolate. This particular chocolate company is still located in the same place. Here's what it looks like today. Can you see the dark brick towards the middle of this photograph? That's the outline of the original building. They've expanded many times. One of the Blummer family just recently sold this company, but one of them said, "We have never had a complaint about the smell of chocolate in the air." But actually they did. They've had to start installing a lot more exhausts and things like that. So what we've got is the perfect concentration: transportation, agricultural products, immigrants bringing a big entrepreneurial spirit too, and suppliers. All of it create, not to mention weather, right? Chicago's got a long winter, so you can make things like chocolate here for a long time before air conditioning. But the Chicago candy business in its early years looked nothing like it does today. Here's an early picture of Chicago in 1832. Chicago was incorporated as a city in 1837. Anyone want to guess what year the city got its first candy factory? Guess.
Year.
What's that?
The next year.
You're very close. Actually, in 1837. The very first candy factory was very similar to a lot of them in the 19th century. It was just a small shop. A guy named John Murr opened up single kitchen factory. It was located on South Water Street, right near Wells. But Murr and a lot of the early candy makers were just small single kitchen operations. They would manufacture the candy and then go store to store selling their candy. And most of the candy, here's ye olde candy shop. The reason we have this stereotype is because it's rooted in reality in a lot of ways. A lot of early retailers of candy sold their candy loose, and they sold it by weight. Candy was not prepackaged. They sold a lot of things like stick candies, lozenge candies, things like that, rock candy, but there were no brands. You wouldn't go out to buy a Babe Ruth or to buy a box of a container of Fannie Mae Pixies. You would go out to buy licorice whips or Gibraltars, which were a kind of peppermint hard candy, or lollipops, things like that. This started to change. Companies started to introduce brands as they started developing unique offerings, and they were often tied to technology. So let me give you a really good early example. Two German immigrants by the name of Ruckheim had a popcorn business. And sometime around the 1880s, they bought a combination popcorn popper peanut roaster from a company called Creeders, a great popcorn innovator. Around 1890, the Ruckheim brothers started experimenting, and they came up with this really good molasses coating for their popcorn and peanuts. Don't say it if you know where I'm going. The legend has been that they debuted it at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1892. 1892, right? 1893. I'm having a brain freeze. I'm not convinced that that's true, but it is true that the candy had no name until 1896. And that is when one of their salesmen, according to legend, was eating some, and he said, "Boy, this stuff is good. It's a Cracker Jack." Cracker Jack was one of the first confections sold under a brand name. And the Ruckheims were really good at marketing their candy. They latched on to the little drawing of Sailor Boy Jack and his dog Bingo. They've been on every package since the 1920s. They developed the famous slogan. You might even be able to see it at the bottom of this image. The more you eat, the more you want. But what really got Cracker Jack going, what really launched it into super celebrity, anyone want to guess what it was? The package. Believe it or not, before it was famous for the prizes or even for being in baseball, Cracker Jack became famous because of the package. If you've ever tried to make candied popcorn, you might know it tends to want to clump together, a big sticky mass. They figured out how to keep each kernel separate and really crispy, which means you could sell it. And do you remember when Cracker Jack came in those boxes and there was like a waxed bag and then the whole box would be wrapped up? That package let Cracker Jack be sold at circuses and carnivals and, yes, baseball games. Anyone want to sing the line about Cracker Jack from the song? You got it. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack, right? As far as I know, they did not pay any product placement fee to be in that song, but it's probably why you can still get Cracker Jack at most major league ballparks. But what we associate Cracker Jack with are the prizes. The prizes first appeared in 1912. Originally, there was like a coupon in the box or on the box side, and you would send it in and they would send you a prize. Instant gratification being what it is, they started putting the prizes in the box. The latest statistics I have is from 2010, which says that more than 23 billion prizes had been given out, toys and trinkets and joke books. There are entire organizations devoted to Cracker Jack prize collecting. Some people can actually date them, you know, a 1930s tin locomotive, things like that. Some ideas have been popular from the beginning. Joke books, temporary tattoos are pretty old, spinners. The most I have ever seen paid for a single Cracker Jack prize is $7,000. If you can believe it. It was a baseball card. So if you have a box of Cracker Jack prizes, don't throw it away. Cracker Jack was purchased by Borden when it was located in Northbrook in 1963. Today, it is owned by Frito-Lay. All right, let's talk about another candy that debuted at the 1893 World's Fair, and it has to do with this guy. I would ask you who his name is, but it's at the top there. This is William Wrigley Jr. William Wrigley Jr. is a great classic American success story. He came to Chicago in 1891, 29 years old, had something like $32 in his pocket. But his father was a soap manufacturer. So he started going door to door selling soap. And as a little extra incentive, the legend goes, he offered a package of baking powder with every order. Well, the baking powder was said to become more popular than the soap. So he dropped the soap, sold baking powder, started offering a free package of gum with every order. Well, then the gum got to be more popular. He ended up buying that gum company, Zeno Gum, and he changed the name to the William Wrigley Gum Company. His first great hit was a fruit-flavored gum called Juicy Fruit, right? Debuted 1893, and just a few months later, Wrigley's Spearmint Gum. He had a few other failures after that. I've seen wrappers for Wrigley's Peach Gum, Wrigley's Pineapple Gum. Didn't have another big hit though until 1914 when he debuted Double Mint Gum. So he has now got his flagships, Spearmint, Juicy Fruit, Double Mint. For the next 70 years, at least, he would only sell these three flavors at 5 cents a pack and made a fortune, which kind of tells you what Wrigley's genius was. It wasn't constant innovation. It wasn't constantly introducing new trendy flavors. It was really good marketing of a quality product. I don't think this little guy was his most famous. This was a mascot known as the Spearman for spearmint gum. Nonetheless, you probably know some of the Wrigley's gum ad campaigns, which means it's time to play Sing That Tune. All right. There's no prizes and there's no grades. So feel free to guess. You ready? Can you sing the Doublemint Gum jingle? Anyone know it? You got it. You got it. You got it. If you don't remember, and I won't sing as nicely as you do, it's double your pleasure, double your fun, double good, double fresh, double mint gum. Wrigley's has not used that song since 1995. But how many of us in this room remember it immediately? It's a good example of the power of Wrigley's advertising. They've had some of the best ad campaigns, and the Doublemint Twins campaign is probably their most famous. They started this in the 1930s. Over the years, what they would do is have double violinists or double piano players or twins riding a tandem bike. They used this right up through the mid-90s when they had Venus and Serena Williams, when they were just starting out in tennis. Of course, the irony there is they're not, twins, but they played doubles. Ever wonder what's double about Doublemint Gum? I thought maybe it had like 2 different mints in it. It's not. It's double distilled peppermint. So it's double strength. So it will, double your fun, right? Double your pleasure. With just those 3 flavors of gum, William Wrigley made enough to put up the Wrigley building on Michigan Avenue, one of the first skyscrapers on Michigan Avenue. That was headquarters until I think 2007 for the company. He also bought Catalina Island, and you might have heard of this baseball team. They still play in Wrigley Field, even though the Wrigley family does not own the Chicago Cubs anymore. Not until the 1970s did the Wrigley company start branching out into more innovative gums. That's when they launched Big Red cinnamon gum and extra sugar-free gum and things like that. But even so, next time you're checking out at a supermarket or a pharmacy or a general merchandise store, look at the gum display. There's a really good likelihood you're going to see juicy fruit or spearmint or doublemint. And that is remarkable for brands that are now well over 100 years old. All right, when we get to the turn of the century, the turn into the 20th century, there is this leap in candy production nationwide. If we look at the United States in 1903, less than $100 million worth of candy is being shipped out from factories. 20 years later, in 1923, that number had jumped to about $300 million. This is a huge jump. Suddenly, everybody's eating a lot more candy, which they were. But the reason we see this big leap is because of this thing we call the Industrial Revolution. Machinery was now available in large amounts to mass manufacture candy, make candy at speeds never before thought of. And they always have these great names. This is an example of a machine called a mogul. A mogul is like a tray of cornstarch and you press molds into it. You can make soft, chewy candies like gummy bears or gumdrops by the thousands. This used to all have to be done by hand. Or an enrober. This is the one of the enrobers at the old Fannie Mae candy factory in Chicago. An enrober is a machine that basically produces a waterfall of melted chocolate. So you put candies over in the lower right, I believe those are raspberry cream centers, on a conveyor belt, and they pass underneath that waterfall of melted chocolate. A machine like this can coat thousands of raspberry creams in the time one person hand dipping can make a few dozen if they're really, really good. So it's no longer possible to just have a kitchen and a recipe if you really want to compete regionally or nationally. Some entrepreneurs got shaken out of the market. Some candy stores didn't really want to go big and kept with the traditional ways, and some of them are still around. Have you ever been to Margie's Candies? Yeah. Do you know Margie's Candies just turned 100 years old? It opened in 1921. It's in Bucktown. It's on Western, right by Armitage. Yes, thank you. It was started by a Greek immigrant, Peter George Polis. His son George later married a woman named Margie, and she later ran it. This is where Al Capone bought some of his candy in the early days. Margie's is a good example of what used to be a much bigger trend, which was local homemade candy shops. At one point, every neighborhood had its own little local hand-dipped candy store. And a lot of Chicago suburbs in the early days had them. Gaiety's Candies opened on the south side of Chicago. I mentioned Gaiety's because a lot of these early candy shops were located right next to movie theaters, because what do we all want when we go to the movies? Gaiety's later closed. It had a suburban branch, and it closed down this one in South Lansing, and people lost their minds because they loved Gaiety's so much. Thankfully, it was reopened. There were many, many of these in the Chicago area, and a lot of them have disappeared over time. But there were also a lot of small candy companies that hit the big time. And one of the biggest was run by E.J. Brock, one of the many German immigrants who made it big in candy. Brock was already in his 40s in 1904 when he scraped together about $1,000 to open up his first candy shop. And he grandly called it Brock's Palace of Sweets. Isn't that a great name? This is a drawing of it. This was located on North Avenue, right at the edge of Chicago's then enormous German immigrant district. What made Brock's a candy powerhouse was not so much a flavor or a recipe, although he had a really good baked caramel recipe. It was that he loved technology, and he invested early on in advanced wrapping equipment. He had equipment that could individually wrap peppermint discs and butterscotch discs and caramels and toffees. That packing equipment is what laid the foundation for Brock's to become the biggest seller of bulk and bagged candies. Here's another great ad from the 1960s. In this ad, underneath the Brock's candy words, it says, "Created especially for summer." In the days before universal air conditioning, it was really difficult for a lot of stores to stock chocolate in the summertime. One of the reasons chocolate is so fabulous is that it is a solid at room temperature, but it melts at body temperature. It melts at about 90 degrees. Great if you're eating chocolate, right? Not so great if you're running a store and you're trying to stock chocolate when the temperature starts rising over 90 degrees. Some storekeepers didn't stock chocolate in the summer, and some manufacturers didn't make chocolate in the summertime. Brock's was making things like orange slices and spicettes, and do you remember jelly nougats in the H there? It was white nougat with little chopped up gumdrops in it. They still make them, but they're hard to find. The Brock's factory on the west side of Chicago, this opened in 1923. It was eventually enlarged to become, according to Brock's, and I'm sure they were unbiased, the world's largest candy making operation under one roof. During peak seasons at Brock, They could employ as many as 4,500 people. That is a lot of candy making going on. But here's the thing. The more technology is easily available, the more any store that wants to can start mass manufacturing its own candy. Before long, you had candy in places like Woolworths. Do you remember the old Woolworths stores? This is an interior image of one of the Woolworths stores. They did buy some of the candy that they sold, but they manufactured some of it themselves and sold it under the Woolworths brand name. As did Walgreens. Here's the old Walgreens at State and Madison. Walgreens, it looks like the Marshall Fields clock, but it's not. That's the clock from the old Boston store. Walgreens made its own Walgreens cold cream, Walgreens aspirin, and Walgreens candy. At one point, there were 7 department stores on State Street in Chicago. All of them had their own candy kitchen, of which maybe the most famous was this one. This is the candy kitchen up on the 13th floor of Marshall Field's flagship store on State Street. It is here that they made Frango mints. By the way, my box is empty, so I can't. I don't think you'd want Frango mints from the 70s or so. Frango mints have this legend shrouded in history. What is true is that Marshall Fields got the rights to the Frango name when they purchased Frederick and Nelson. Frederick and Nelson was one of the great Seattle department stores. The legend has always been that they were originally called Franco mints with a C, but then Generalissimo Franco came to power in Spain, and they didn't want this thing named after a fascist dictator, so they changed the C to a G. Franco became Frango. It's a great story. It's not true. Some historians had to come along and they looked up the trademark documents. Frederick and Nelson trademarked Frango with a G in 1918, long before Generalissimo Franco came to power. So it probably stood for Frederick and Nelson goodness, or maybe the tango, which was a big dance at the time. Whatever the case, Marshall Fields bought Frederick and Nelson, got the rights to the Frango, and started making their own Frango mint candy in 1946. Do you want to guess the original price of a pound of Frango mints in 1946? $1.50. What is it now? I think it's $25 a pound or something like that. Anyway, the more that anyone can make their own candy, the more nostalgic people get for homemade mom and pop candy shops. And one guy who recognized this was H. Teller Archibald, the creator of Fannie Mae. Now, if you have ever wondered who was Fannie Mae, was it, the founder's mother or aunt or grandmother? No, there never was a Fannie Mae. He made it up. The name started to be applied to his wife eventually, but he made up the name Fannie Mae because it sounded old-fashioned and home-like. This is the very first Fannie Mae candy store, opened at 11 North LaSalle Street. It sold its candy on the basis that the candies were fresh, homemade every day. These are not mass manufactured, they're fresh. It was an instant success. Within 15 years, he had 47 Fannie Mae shops around the U.S., the Midwest. They all had to be within 1 day's driving distance of the factory in Chicago because they didn't have the same shelf life. To this day, if you ever buy Fannie Mae candies in a drugstore or a supermarket, they often will have them in those refrigerated cases because they don't have the preservatives that a lot of other candies have. Fannie Mae stores always had this old-fashioned, home-like appeal. Ooh, I don't know what happened to that. This is a later Fannie Mae shop. Well, what I wanted to show you was they always made it look kind of like her signature on the stores, where you can see that store is labeled Fannie Mae Candies. Fannie Mae later joined up with Fannie Farmer and became the largest retail candy chain in the US. And there are other retail chains in Chicago. One of them was Mrs. Snyder's. There really was a Mrs. Snyder. Her slogan was, "I can't make all the candy in the world, so I just make the best of it." And there were other chains. Dutch Mill was known for its Dutch chocolate, which was less acidic, more alkaline, things like that. But here's what really changes candy. World War I. This is a postcard labeled cigars, cigarettes, and candy bars. To feed the troops, the US government needed what it always needs, which is cheap, high-calorie, non-perishable food, and if it's in individual portions, better. This is the perfect environment for this new creation, the candy bar. Candy bars were brand new. The first American candy bar was the Hershey bar, and that was 1900. The first combination candy bar in the US was the Clark bar in 1916. So it's new, but perfect for the military. This is the first war where the government buys a lot of candy bars for the troops. And when the doughboys come back, they want their candy bars. The 1920s and 30s are the heyday of new candy bar introduction. Most of our favorite candies actually date to the 20s and 30s. Here's a good one. Baby Ruth. Baby Ruth was first made by the Curtis Candy Company, started by a manufacturer named Otto Schneering. He founded his company in 1916. He did not call it the Otto Schneering Candy Company because German names like Schneering were not really popular in 1916 in the US. So he took his mother's name, Curtis, which sounded much more Anglo. Baby Ruth was his first big hit, and it was introduced in 1920. And I have another quiz question for you. I will read it out loud if you can't read it, or those of you joining us virtually if you can't see your screen. The Baby Ruth candy bar is named after A, the daughter of Curtis founder Otto Schneering, B, the daughter of US President Grover Cleveland, or C, the baseball star George Herman Babe Ruth. What do you think? B, C, B, C. I'm hearing a lot of B's, a couple of C's. The answer is B or C, depending on who you would like to believe. The Curtis Candy Company always said it was named for Ruth Cleveland, beloved daughter of Grover Cleveland. Historians are a little skeptical. Ruth Cleveland died in 1904, which is 16 years before the candy bar comes out. And guess who was the most famous athlete in the US in 1920? Babe Ruth had just set a new record for home runs hit in one season. It is possible, and I am not going to say it, but it's possible, that the Ruth Cleveland name was a way to avoid retrospective litigation from Babe Ruth, but still kind of ride on the name recognition of his name. The second candy bar they had a big hit with was Butterfinger. Got its name from the phrase that sportscasters would use if an athlete always dropped the ball. What a Butterfinger. And like other candy makers, Schneering was really good at promotions. He sponsored air contests, taking advantage of the name Curtis. There was an aircraft manufacturer by the same name, no relation. He put the Baby Ruth logo on everything. Beach balls and tissue holders and folding knives and dolls and matchbooks. Sides of all of his factory buildings had a huge Baby Ruth logo. He would sponsor circuses and paint the Baby Ruth logo on elephants. He was also one of the first to promote candy as a quick energy food. I love this ad. They did an actual test to see how far could a 154-pound man run at a speed of 5.25 miles per hour on the muscle fuel in one Baby Ruth. And the answer is 1 and 5-6 miles. So if you ever need to run 1 and 5-6 miles and you weigh 154 pounds, all you need is a baby room. And can you see what is written on this runner's green shirt? There are the letters NRG. Energy, you got it. NRG, energy. This idea, when you need a quick shot of energy, have a candy bar. This is used a lot in candy advertising today, but it was really new when Otto Schneering started using them. Couple other candies from this era, Milk Duds. Milton J. Holloway made a fortune with Slow Pokes and Black Pat. Remember Slow Pokes, the caramel suckers on a stick? Milk Duds debuted in 1928, and they got their name because the original company that made them was trying to make a perfectly round chocolate-covered caramel, but the machinery kept turning them out flattened. They were misshapen. They were duds. So the name was kind of an in-joke. All right, another candy quiz question for you. Again, feel free to guess. True or false? Tootsie Rolls were invented in Chicago. Yes. Yes? The answer is false. But Tootsie Rolls moved to Chicago in 1966, first the factory and then the headquarters, which gives you a sense of how old this candy is. The candy itself was invented by an Austrian immigrant, Leo Hirschfeld, in 1896. He had a daughter named Clara. Anyone want to guess what Clara's nickname was? Tootsie Roll, by the way, has maintained a lot of its profitability by buying other classic candies, often non-chocolate candies. So they make Charms Lollipops and Dots Gumdrops, Andes Mints. And do you remember those wax bottles? They make a version of those today. But the biggest candy maker to come out of Chicago was probably Frank Mars, inventor of the Milky Way. In 1923, Frank Mars was living in Minneapolis when he had this idea for a candy bar that tasted like a malted milkshake. This was the latest ice cream hit, invented at Walgreens in Chicago. The Milky Way candy bar was his first massively popular candy bar. Demand for it grew so big that he moved his factory and headquarters to Chicago, again, to take advantage of Chicago's transportation networks and location. And he built this factory. I think this might be the Taj Mahal of candy factories. This is on Oak Park Avenue in Chicago, opened in 1929. Did you hear the news? They just announced that they are closing this factory. Yeah. They're slowly phasing it out, which is so sad. Yeah. So sad because not only did they make Milky Way bars here, but it was here that they invented the Three Musketeers in 1932. This is not a great ad, but it shows you originally Three Musketeers was 3 miniature bars in one package with 3 flavors. One had a chocolate center, one had a vanilla center, one had a strawberry center. We don't remember that because strawberries were rationed during World War II. So they switched and had all chocolate and people loved that. So they had all chocolate centers and then they just got rid of the 3 candy bars. So today there is nothing 3 about Three Musketeers, but that was the original concept. And in 1930 in Chicago, he introduced Snickers candy bar. Today, this is the #1 best-selling candy bar in American history. According to M&M Mars, in any given month, 45% of Americans will eat a Snickers bar. Now think about the amount of production required for that kind of consumption. gives you an idea of why Mars today is one of the largest privately held companies. It's still privately held to this day. Today, they are no longer headquartered in Chicago. They have about 15 factories in the US and 40 factories worldwide. But what Mars is really known for is high-speed, cutting-edge technology. This is a photograph taken about 10 years ago inside the Mars factory in Chicago. If it were not for those Snickers bags, you might not even know that this was a candy factory. They are known for constantly reinvesting profits in ever more efficient technology. The latest statistics I've seen for this factory is that, do you know those fun-size Milky Way candy bars? They can make 5,520 of those bars per minute at the Chicago factory. Now, Snickers is the only candy bar that I know of that is still around that was originally named for a horse. Well, many in the family loved horse racing and horse breeding, and in 1930, their favorite horse was named Snickers. But that is a good example of Chicago candy makers' real pioneering in giving candy bars whimsical, amusing names that are easy to remember. One of the earliest was O. Henry, not named for the short story writer, the guy who wrote Gift of the Magi. When O. Henry candy bars debuted, the George Williamson Company had several legends, but the most popular one was the Williamson factory where they made O. Henry had a little retail store, and young women worked the counter in that store. And every day at about the same time, a young man named Henry would come in to flirt with those young women. So when they saw him, they would say, "Ah, Henry, you're here. I need you to help me with this, or could you do that?" So when they had to name the candy bar, one of the salesmen said, "Just call it O. Henry. That's all we hear around this place." Whether or not that's true, it is true that O. Henry was one of the first candy bars to be launched nationally, not regionally. They took out billboards, they put up ads in magazines like Saturday Evening Post. And Williamson did a lot of creative marketing. He had a very early cookbook. This is from 1926, 60 new ways to serve a famous candy. So it's got recipes for O. Henry ice cream, O. Henry pie, O. Henry cookies, and my favorite, O. Henry stuffed tomatoes. You chop up O. Henry, mix it with some mayonnaise and salt, and you stuff it into hollowed out tomatoes. Sadly, O. Henry bars are no longer manufactured. Nestle made them right up until a few years ago. Otherwise, we would all run out and make this weekend. The advantage of the name was it's easy to remember. And when it was still kind of new to buy candy by a brand name, this is a name that sticks in your mind. And he had some others. He had an O. Mabel, which was never as famous as O. Henry. He had a candy called Guess What? That had a little toy surprise in it. And this is my favorite name. That's mine! Exclamation point. Other candy makers quickly copied this. This is where we get candies with these crazy names like Chewy Louie and Snurkles. And here's one you might remember. Chocolate, the little jelly candies, all part of that whimsical naming tradition. There were candy bars named after celebrities like Red Grange and Charles Lindbergh. The problem with this is once your celebrity is not a celebrity anymore, sales plummet. And that happened with the Reggie bar. When Curtis introduced the Reggie bar in the 70s, it was named for Reggie Jackson. Once he stopped playing baseball, sales plummeted. And there were even some candy bars named after national crazes. We don't think of Brock's as making candy bars, but they had a bar called the Swing Bar, which was named after the swing dance and swing music. Can anyone think of a candy bar that is still around that was also named after a dance? You got it. The Charleston Chew. It's long outlived the Charleston dance, and we don't even associate it, but that was the original concept. World War II gave a big jump to candy sales. This is a 1943 emergency K ration. Those boxes at the top represent 3 meals: breakfast, dinner, and supper. If you have good eyesight, you might be able to see there is a stick of Wrigley's gum in each meal. Wrigley's put so much production towards military rations, they did not have enough sugar to supply the civilian market too. So they put up billboards. Remember this wrapper, after the war, we will be back. A lot of candy companies won awards for supplying the military. Brock's supplied a lot of things like lemon drops for pilots at high altitude to help with ear pressure problems. Among American soldiers, candy consumption reached a high of, get this, 50 pounds per person per year. Today, the average American eats 25 pounds of candy per person per year, and we think that's a lot. A lot of candy companies took out ads. This is a Curtis ad, a guy cleaning up after soldiers and saying, don't these guys eat anything but Baby Ruth? Meaning, this is what your GIs really want in their care package. As a result of this war, chocolate became closely associated with patriotism. This is the food that sustained the soldiers. Post-war candy sales were enormous. But you don't see as much innovation in the 50s as you did back in the 20s. In the 1950s, you see the emergence of the big trends that dominate the candy industry today. So let's talk about these trends today. I'm going to show you a list of the top 10 best-selling candy bars in the US today. They are not all from Chicago, but I bet you recognize them. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups, M&M's Milk Chocolate, Snickers, Hershey Milk Chocolate, Kit Kat, Three Musketeers, Milky Way, Almond Joy, and York Peppermint Patty. Now, the reason I'm showing you this list is I want to show you the years that these candies were introduced. Take a look at the years and notice how many debuted after 1950. If you can't read the list, it's 1928, 1941, 1930, 1900, 1935, 1979, 1932, 1932, 1946, 1940. How many after 1950? One. Twix is the one and only. We are very loyal to our favorite candies in this country. It is really hard to get Americans to try something new. 65% of mass manufactured candy brands today have been around 60 years or more. Most of our favorites date to the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. It's amazing. This is why spin-offs are so big today. Have you noticed how many M&Ms there are these days? M&M's almonds, M&M's espresso, M&M's caramel. They know that you'll try an M&M spin-off sooner than you will try a new candy. Here's another example. Anyone remember a candy bar called Forever Yours? Do you remember this? If you like dark chocolate. Forever Yours, those of you joining us virtually, I'm holding up a wrapper. This was made by Mars. It was vanilla nougat with caramel covered in dark chocolate. Mars pulled it from the market in the late 70s, tweaked it, and when they relaunched it, they called it Milky Way Dark. And now it's Milky Way Midnight Dark, because they know you will try a Milky Way spinoff sooner than a whole new trend. Candy bar spinoffs are really big. Yeah.
Mars dropped the Mars name on the almond bar.
That's right.
And they call it Snickers almond.
That's a great example. If anyone remembers, Mars used to have a candy bar. And for a while, it was just called a Mars bar. It was called Mars Almond. Early, it was like toasted almond or something. They have dropped that. It is now known as Snickers almond. Because you'll try it, right? You might try a Snickers almond if you like Snickers.
Sales too.
Yes, exactly. It works.
Yeah.
And that's why they do it. So spin-offs are big. For another trend, let me show you the names of the companies that manufacture these candy bars today. Take a look at the list and see if you notice anything. If you can't read it, it goes Hershey, Mars, Mars, Hershey, Hershey, Mars, 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 Hershey, Hershey. The two big giants, Hershey and Mars, control about 2/3 of the average American candy aisle today in a supermarket or mass merchandise store. Consolidation has been a massive factor in the candy industry over the last 30, 40 years. And it's had a big impact on the Chicago candy industry. A number of big Chicago candy manufacturers have shut down, even though their brands are still alive. Here's a good example. Whoppers, I mentioned earlier, originally made by the Great Leaf Candy Company in Chicago. Leaf no longer exists in the US, but Whoppers still exist because they were purchased by Hershey, and Hershey makes them today. We see this over and over. Same thing with Milk Duds, right? Milk Duds are the Milton J. Halloway Company no longer exists, but Milk Duds are still being made. Candy companies that were not subject to consolidation or being bought out by other companies have really struggled to be profitable, especially hard candy companies. Here's the factory for Peerless. This particular company, Peerless, opened in 1924. They closed in 2007 in large part because the price of sugar on the US market can be very high. We have very high tariffs on sugar importation, so it can be double that of the global market. There was a lot of pressure on Peerless to move their factory out of the US. They didn't want to, so they shut down. Similar thing with Brock's. Brock's Candy went through multiple ownership changes, especially in the 80s and the 90s. It ended up with them being bought by a Swiss candy maker called Caillet-Bott. Caillet-Bott closed the Chicago factory, left it abandoned when it relocated all of its production out of the country, mostly in Mexico. That factory, by the way, was abandoned for a long time until it was demolished a couple of years ago. It actually made a cameo appearance in the movie Batman, The Dark Knight. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
If you saw the movie Batman, The Dark Knight, there's a scene where the Joker blows up Gotham City Hospital.
Oh.
The building that was imploded was one of the Brock's administration buildings in Chicago. A sort of sad end for this great company. Similarly, Wrigley closed its Chicago factory in the mid-2000s. Frango candies were relocated out of Chicago in 1999. Most Frangos are made out of state, although some of them were relocated back to Cupid Candies. Fannie Mae went bankrupt in 2004. They have come back, but production is now located in Ohio. They say it's the same, but Chicagoans will tell you it's not, right? And water can actually change the taste of things. According to one trade group, employment in the Chicago candy industry shrank by half in 1 decade. Between 1995 and 2005, it went from 13,600 workers to 7,000 workers. Candy is nothing like what it used to be. There really isn't a single major center for candy production in the US anymore, but Chicago is still a player. The metropolitan Chicago area is still home to the Blummer Chocolate Company, Chicago factory, Tootsie Roll, still headquartered in Chicago. For the moment, Ferrara Pan Candy Company, still here, recently acquired by Ferraro. And Ferraro is still making Baby Ruth and Butterfinger in the Chicago area. World's Finest Chocolate is still here. Many of them, though, are expected to leave soon or have already announced they are leaving soon. All right, let me finish up with 2 last candy quiz questions for you. All right. First, which holiday is #1 for candy sales in the US? Is it A, Valentine's Day, B, Easter, C, Halloween, or D, Christmas and the other winter holidays? What do you think? Easter? Halloween? A lot of Halloween. The correct answer is Halloween. We spend about 2.6 billion in a non-pandemic year on Halloween candy. However, Easter is right on its heels and it's expected to supersede Halloween soon. We spend about 2.5 billion annually on chocolate bunnies and jelly beans and other Easter candies. Winter holidays are 2 billion. Valentine's Day is 1.8 billion. It's only 1.8 billion on chocolate. And finally, which of these countries consumes the most chocolate per person per year? A, Switzerland, B, the United States, C, the United Kingdom, or D, Japan? What do you think? Oh, we're kind of all over. The correct answer is A, Switzerland. The Swiss eat just under 20 pounds of chocolate per person, which is double the United States. We eat 9.5 pounds per person per year. In the UK, it's about 16 pounds. In Japan, just under 4 pounds. Every candy maker wants to open up the Japanese market more. I think this is the perfect excuse for us to eat as much chocolate as we want and eat it for Halloween so we can keep Halloween standing, right? So that's my final gift to you. So thank you all so much. I always try too much. If anyone needs to go, please feel free. But if anyone has questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Or if anyone has stories, I love stories. So yeah.
Which came first, rocks, jots, or M&Ms?
It was actually M&Ms. M&Ms came first. If you didn't hear the question, which came first, Brock's Jots, or do I have Jots? No, I've got Brock's Beanies. M&Ms have a great backstory. Very briefly, it has to do with Frank Mars' son, Forrest, who was one of the great characters in the history of candy making. He hated his father. So his father gave him the European rights to Mars candy and shipped him off to Europe. And it was in Europe that he saw these chocolate candy coated candies called Smarties. British Smarties have nothing to do with American Smarties. And he thought this was brilliant. So he came back to the US and introduced his own version as M&Ms. The fun part about it is because nobody really knows what the M's stand for in M&Ms. One of them is Mars because of, Forrest Mars. The other one stands for Murray. Because Mr. Murray was president of Hershey during World War II, and that's when M&Ms debuted. They could not get the rights to cacao importation during World War II unless they had a connection, and Hershey had a connection. So, this candy, Mr. Murray's never going to be able to own the Hershey Chocolate Company. So Forrest Mars said, why doesn't your son come in business with me and I'll name this candy after him? M and M, Mars and Murray. So they did, and it debuted during World War II, initially successful with soldiers, and then with kids, because it melts in your mouth, not in your hands. Mr. Murray got kicked out very quickly. The M&M Jots, I'd have to look up when they debuted. I want to say it was in the 50s, but I'd have to look it up. They were in that 63 ad, so we know they existed by the 60s. Unless I'm wrong. Anyone correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my memory. So.
Up until the 60s.
Wait, sorry, what's that?
Always spoken for M&M.
It melts in your mouth, not in your hands. No, that slogan, by my understanding, came about because they did some market research and they found out that kids liked M&Ms because of all the bright colors. But parents like the M&Ms because they don't make a mess. that slogan, melts in your mouth, not in your hands, was really aimed at parents. Kids don't care if they make a mess with their chocolate, but the parents who have to clean up after them do. So it was a kind of subtle, very effective marketing. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
So up until the sixties, Mars was buying all its bulk chocolate from Hershey's. They ship it to the plant
Yes,
in
right?
equal box, Portland.
Yes.
They bring them to the mill.
Yes, exactly. Did you work for Mars?
Yeah.
Excellent.
But
I'm jealous.
the family decided they were gonna build their own chocolate plants. And within a month, they had told Hershey's, we're not buying your chocolate anymore. That almost.
And that was a huge, I don't know if you heard what he was pointing out. Mars actually used to purchase its chocolate from Hershey and did so right up through the 50s. And then when Mars went into producing a lot of its own chocolate, they ended their contracts. They ended their relationship with Hershey. And that was devastating to the Hershey company because they were a massive customer.
Of Hershey's business.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone is interested in the Hershey Mars competition, and it is a great story. The book over here called Emperors of Chocolate, do you know this book? It's a great discussion of how these two companies, so different in their approaches and their histories, and just battled it out.
Why the flavors taste the way they do.
Why the flavors taste the way they do. Yes, that's right. That's right. It's a great story about how Hershey chocolate has that kind of tangy, almost sour taste, and different chocolates like, correct me if I'm wrong, the Snickers bar has a chocolate that has a certain sort of a peanut taste to it. Milky Way has a little bit more of a malt flavor. Right, exactly. It's a great, and how M&Ms, they figured out how to stamp that M on each candy without breaking the shell. Oh, right. Other things, yeah.
Been kind of a twofold. I had always heard that the Mars factory on Oak Park Avenue, that it was incredibly expensive. And you could eat off that floor.
There you go.
And then Mars, he had his house in River Forest. And I lived in River Forest for a while.
Yeah.
And they were gonna knock the house down. And he was on 2 lots, so his front door faces the lot.
Yeah.
And there was a group trying to get it to be a historical landmark so that they wouldn't knock the house down, but they lost and they tore it down and ended up building.
And build up some
but it was a
ridiculous
phenomenal,
thing. I can believe it. I can believe it. You know, the Mars factory, there were a lot of concerns, especially in the late 19th century, about adulterated candy, candy that has, they need a red color, so they just mix in some brick dust, or they need it shiny, so they just, we're talking about 1880s. The National Confectioners Association was founded in Chicago partly to get over those fears and ensure quality standards. And it was because candy makers were in Chicago. Because of that, a lot of these candy companies really took extra pains to be as clean as possible. And I saw a great Mars factory brochure from like the 30s or the 40s, and it shows all of the workers lining up, and they had to show their fingernails were nice and clean, and the hair nets and no jewelry. They said these are the sunshine-filled, clean candy kitchens at Mars. And they always said, you know why it's called Milky Way? It's because of the pure, fresh milk. That's in it. It's because it's Mars, right? The best candy in the world comes from Mars. No, Milky Way, right?
And you're aware that Mars bought William Wrigley's.
Yes, that's right. Mars joined up with Wrigley's in not too long ago. Yeah, about 10 years ago. Yeah. Wrigley's is now an independent subsidiary of Mars, although they still have a factory in Yorkville, Illinois. So if you ever go to Yorkville and it smells like spearmint or cinnamon or things like that, that's why. All right. Yeah.
Most popular candy in the South Pacific, World War II. M&M's.
Was it? There you go.
Didn't melt.
Very good. Very good.
The ration.
Yeah. Do you, have you ever, were you in, you're too young, you're much too young. During World War II, M&Ms were originally packaged in round tubes that you could easily slip in your pocket if you were a soldier. So they really did go to great lengths, and it's perfect for the South Pacific, right? Because, you know, it's not going to melt quite as easily as a Hershey bar will.
And the other ones melted in the package before they could be.
Yeah, exactly. Or they made, you know, and Hershey made a couple of special tropics bars and they were just awful. So, all right, one last question. Yeah, in the back.
Would you happen to know, given the history of the confectionery industry in Chicago, if that's where the confectionery union got started as well?
No, I don't. That's a really good question. I don't know that. I know they were very active in this area, but I don't know. Any chance you know? I don't want to put you on the spot.
The union?
The unions, yeah, they started in
Not at
Chicago.
Mars.
Not at Mars, no. Good question.
I think.
All right, should we do one more? Sorry, yeah.
Do you know anything about Peeps?
Do I know anything about Peeps? They're great. No, I don't. And the reason I don't is because they were not a Chicago brand. And most of my research really focused on the Chicago brand. But if I can tell you really briefly about them, you know, I will say Peeps are a really good example of candies that try to compete against Hershey and Mars, often specialize in certain niche, often holiday focused candies. And Peeps are a perfect example of that. And I'm betting I didn't put it on my list. No, I didn't. So there you go. There you go. No, I'd have to look it up, but we should all go and expand our candy knowledge. So thank you all so much for being here.
Unfortunately, the library closes in about 7 minutes, or we could
jealous.
go on and on about candy.
I'm sure everyone's jealous. They don't have their jobs.